The moment my world tilted happened in the glow of our living room Christmas lights, their warm gold reflecting off polished ornaments as if mocking everything I was about to hear. Dad held his phone at arm's length, his hand trembling just enough for me to notice the soft chime of an incoming call, slicing through the laughter that had filled the house seconds earlier. I watched the color drain from his face, the room dimming around him as though the house itself understood what was coming. The conversation had been light, filled with the clink of glasses and the soft rustle of winter coats being gathered from chairs. But when he said the name, Richard Thompson, even the air shifted, like the temperature dropped 10 degrees in an instant. Every head turned. Sarah froze halfway through a sip of her wine. Michael, who had just been bragging about some acquisition deal, lowered his voice mid-sentence. The fireplace popped sharply, sending a brief flash of orange across the hardwood. Then came the question that ripped the whole night open. Is your daughter the Emma Carter that Forbes just named the youngest billionaire in America? That sentence didn't echo it, hit the room like a physical blow, heavy and bone deep, leaving a silence so absolute I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the next room. No one moved. No one breathed. Christmas lights flickered against stunned faces, casting shadows that made everyone look older, smaller, stripped bare. And there I stood in the corner chair, the spot I'd been quietly pushed into for years, watching the truth unravel everything they thought they knew. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from, and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have cared for you. I wasn't always the person whose name could silence a room. Most days, I was just Emma, 29 years old, living quietly in my own small home in Massachusetts, spending long hours in front of servers and glowing monitors that hummed like loyal companions. To my family, though, I had always been the odd one. The girl who loved code more than crowds, machines more than small talk. Growing up, our house always smelled faintly of lemon polish and my mother's lavender hand cream, the kind she'd rub in nervously whenever conversations drifted toward me. My brother Michael, 3 years older, filled the space effortlessly, tall, confident, the kind of man who walked into a room and made the lights seem a little brighter. I learned early that my victories earned polite smiles, while his triumphs earned a celebration. I can still remember how my father's voice swelled with pride when Michael made varsity football, the way he slapped him on the back so hard, the sound echoed down the hallway. When I was named valedictorian a year later, Dad handed me a bouquet from the grocery store and said, "Great job, honey," before turning the conversation back to Michael's upcoming playoff game. The air that day smelled of cut grass and aftershave, and even then, I knew where I stood in the family ranking. After college, MIT double major, summa cum laude, I came home to what everyone called a phase. I turned the basement into my lab, filling it with racks of servers, stacks of processors, and whiteboards so covered in equations that visitors silently backed away. Down there, with the cool concrete under my bare feet and the steady thrum of machines in my ears, I felt capable. But upstairs, I was treated like someone who hadn't figured out how to be an adult. Mom used to lower her voice when friends asked about me. "She's doing computer work," she'd say, smoothing her sweater as though reassuring herself. Very bright, but, not practical. The smell of her peppermint tea always drifted between us when she said it warm and sad, like she was mourning a version of me that had never existed. Michael, meanwhile, wore success, like cologne, strong, expensive, impossible to ignore. Harvard MBA, Goldman Sachs, corner office, Tiffany blue tie clips and perfect hair. Every time he walked into a room, relatives straightened their posture, leaning toward him like flowers toward the sun. And every year at Christmas, I found myself tucked away in the same corner chair, listening to conversations swirl around earnings, bonuses, private schools, ski trips in Aspen. A spot where I could help pass appetizers, nod politely, and pretend I didn't hear when someone referred to me as still figuring things out. The scent of roasted ham and pine needles always hung thick in the air, blending with the dull ache in my chest. The first real fracture came the year my cousin Sarah, always polished, always drinking just a little too much at family gatherings, looked me up and down and sighed. "Emma, you're almost 30. Still single still. Tinkering. Don't you think it's time to stop embarrassing yourself?" Her voice was honeyed but sharp, the kind that pretends to care while cutting you open. The room went quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock. And in that silence, I realized something cold and heavy. They didn't just misunderstand me. They pitied me. They believed deep down that I had wasted my life. I said nothing. Not that night. Not then. I simply sat back in that corner chair, letting their assumptions play out like a script written long before I'd entered the room. What none of them knew, not Sarah, not Michael, not even my parents, was that downstairs beneath their feet, something extraordinary was taking shape. Something that would force them all to look at me differently. And Christmas was coming. So was the reckoning. The cafeteria smelled like overcooked pasta and bleach the afternoon I learned what it meant to be invisible. I was 12 arms wrapped tightly around a plastic tray, watching Michael and his friends take over the middle table, the one under the bright skylight where the sun spilled across their shoulders like a spotlight. My seat was supposed to be beside him, or at least it used to be, but that day, he looked straight past me, laughing at something one of the boys said. I stood there, long enough to feel the heat from the overhead lamps warming my cheeks, long enough for the chatter around me to turn into a low static. When I finally worked up the courage to ask if I could sit down, he didn't even look up. He nudged the empty chair away, with his foot sliding it under the table as though he were tidying up for someone else. "Find another spot." He muttered, voice flat, eyes fixed on a carton of chocolate milk he was opening. The boys snickered. One of them drummed his fingers on the table, each tap a soft, sharp sting in the air. I stood frozen, staring at the chair's metal legs glinting under the fluorescent lights. After a moment, one of the lunch aides called out, encouraging me to move along. Her voice was gentle, but it carried over the clattering trays and shouting kids like a stage cue. I walked away, tray trembling in my hands, and sat alone near the windows where the winter cold seeped through the glass. My food tasted like nothing at all. All I could hear was the hum of the heating vent and the laughter from Michael's table drifting toward me like a reminder of where I didn't belong. Years have passed, but I can still hear those echoes when the room grows too quiet, when someone's eyes slide past me the way his did that day. Looking back, that was only one moment in a long line of small exclusions that shaped the way I learned to take up as little space as possible. Our house growing up was always filled with a certain brightness, sunlight through sheer curtains, the citrusy scent of Mom's cleaning spray, the rhythmic clink of Dad's tools in the garage. But beneath all that shine, there was a quiet current that ran through every room, flowing in Michael's favor. From early on, it was clear he was the child the family understood. The one whose interests matched the stories adults liked telling at barbecues and holiday dinners. When he brought home his first trophy, a chipped plastic football player caught mid-sprint, my parents placed it in the center of the living room mantel. I remember the feel of the cool tile under my feet as I stood staring at it that evening, listening to Mom brag to a neighbor about how our boy has real athletic talent. My spelling bee ribbon, won the same week, lay folded on the kitchen counter, where no one saw it unless they happened to reach for napkins. It wasn't that anyone was cruel. It was subtler than that. A lingering pause before acknowledging my successes. A soft, "That's nice," instead of the booming "well done" Michael received. A gentle encouragement to get out more or try something social whenever I retreated into books or coding kits. Moments layered on moments until they formed something heavier than resentment, something closer to resignation. School nights often ended with Michael sprawled across the couch, the TV glowing in the dim room, while Dad quizzed him about strategy and teamwork. I'd sit at the dining table with my math worksheets pencil scratching across paper, the faint smell of dinner lingering in the air. When I solved a particularly difficult problem, I'd look up waiting for someone to notice the pride warming my face. But the only sounds that came were the low rumble of the TV and the rise and fall of their conversation. Even holidays followed the same pattern. At Thanksgiving, relatives arrived with cranberry dishes and stories of their children's accomplishments. They'd ask Michael about his latest game, his future plans, whether he'd follow in Dad's footsteps or chart his own path. When they turned to me, their questions changed. Still reading those science books, still tinkering with those little gadgets, their smiles were kind, but their eyes drifted away before I finished answering. I learned to shrink my voice to soften the excitement in my tone. I began offering shorter explanations for things I cared about because I could feel their attention fading. I remember sitting in my bedroom late at night, the desk lamp casting a warm circle over my notebooks, the faint hum of my first homemade computer filling the quiet. Those nights held a strange mix of comfort and ache. I felt alive, solving problems, sketching ideas, imagining a future built from circuits and algorithms. But I also knew these moments existed entirely separate from the family's world. Mom tried in her own way. She'd peek into the basement years later, holding a laundry basket against her hip, asking gentle questions about the wires and blinking lights. But her voice had that careful tone, like she was stepping around something fragile. She couldn't hide the worry in her eyes, the slight wrinkle in her forehead, the way she'd run her fingers along the banister as if grounding herself. "Just don't lose yourself down here," she'd say, the smell of fresh laundry drifting behind her. "It's important to stay realistic." Realistic. That word followed me through my 20s like a shadow. It slipped into conversations when I talked about new projects. It floated around family dinners when Michael shared updates about promotions and salary bonuses. It settled over me like a quiet instruction: know your place. Don't expect too much. I didn't fight it, not because I believed they were right, but because I didn't want to burden them with the parts of me they didn't understand. I convinced myself it was easier for them, and for me, if I kept the depth of my ambitions tucked away like a secret that would only confuse them if I spoke it aloud. There were moments, though, when the divide felt especially sharp. Like the night Michael brought home his acceptance letter to Harvard. The kitchen smelled of roasted chicken and rosemary as Mom opened the envelope with trembling hands, reading the first line aloud with a gasp. Dad wrapped Michael in a hug that lifted him off the floor. Their laughter filled every corner of the house. When I found out a year later that I received a full scholarship to MIT, I remember standing in the same kitchen, the letter shaking in my hands. The overhead lights cast a soft glow on the countertops as I waited for them to react. They congratulated me, of course. Mom kissed my forehead. Dad said he was proud. But after a moment, the conversation drifted back to Michael's career plans, internships, and networking opportunities. The warmth faded from the room, leaving the faint hum of the refrigerator and a familiar quiet settling over my shoulders. I carried those silences with me for years. The empty spaces after my achievements. The polite nods that followed my enthusiasm. The unspoken belief that my successes belonged in the basement out of sight. By the time I reached my late 20s, I'd perfected the art of invisibility. I knew how to smile through dismissive comments, how to redirect conversations, how to sit quietly in a room full of people who thought they understood me. I told myself it didn't matter that the hum of servers and the cool air of my workspace were enough, that meaning didn't have to be seen to exist. But deep down, I felt the weight of all those years pressing into my ribs. The sense that I needed to prove something not for their approval, but for my own clarity. To show myself that the girl who sat alone in the cafeteria wasn't destined to stay in the shadows. And without their knowing, I began building something in that basement. Something larger than the doubts they carried. Something that would stretch far beyond the walls of our home and into a world they never imagined I could touch. I didn't know then that the truth would come out the way it did. That a single phone call would slice through decades of assumptions. That a quiet Christmas night would split open the story they'd written for me. But looking back now, I can feel it, the faint tremor in the air, as the foundation began to shift, as the things hidden beneath years of silence finally pushed toward the surface. Something was coming. Something no one in that house was prepared to face. The email came through at 2:17 in the morning, its arrival marked by a soft chime that cut through the quiet hum of the basement servers. I remember leaning forward, the blue-white glow of the monitor lighting my face as I opened the message without thinking. A PDF loaded slowly, the progress bar inching across the screen like it was reluctant to reveal what waited. My breath fogged faintly in the cool basement air as the document finally snapped into view. Financial summaries, investor updates, valuation drafts. At the top, in crisp black text, was the title, Quantum Dynamics, Final IPO Filing Confidential. My hands trembled as I scrolled. Numbers spilled across the screen, projections, market analyses, calculations I had lived with for years, but now compiled into something undeniable, something real. At the bottom of the page was the figure that made my stomach drop. Estimated post-IPO net worth $3.8 billion. My name was printed beside it. Emma Carter, founder and CEO. The words felt both foreign and familiar, as if I'd been carrying them in the back of my mind for years, waiting for this moment to make them visible. Behind me, one of the servers whirred louder, a low mechanical sigh that filled the silence. The cold concrete floor pressed against my bare feet. I clicked through the attachments, Forbes Drafts Reporter Inquiries Board confirmations, each one a spark landing in dry grass. Then came the final tab, an internal memo from our lead underwriter for release pending final verification. Anticipated media coverage extensive. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. The world knew. They had known for hours. And no one in my family had the faintest idea. It took a long time to exhale, and when I finally did, the air left my chest slow and shaky, like the beginning of a storm I had never seen coming. The shock of that night still lingers in my bones, the way a cold front leaves frost even after sunrise. Once the initial wave passed, I sat back in my chair, letting the leather creak softly under my weight. The basement lights were dim pools of yellow warmth against shadows that stretched toward the stairwell. I remember rubbing my thumb over the edge of the desk, the varnish smooth and cool, grounding myself as I opened the documents again, this time not as their creator, but as someone trying to understand how everything I'd built had suddenly become public. Somewhere above me, the house settled with a faint groan, the kind it made on winter nights as wood contracted in the cold. Mom and Dad were long asleep, their room down the hall, always faintly scented with the lavender spray Mom used on her pillows. Michael was staying over that weekend, snoring in the guest room, completely unaware that the little sister, still tinkering with computers, had crossed a line he didn't even know existed. The truth wasn't that I had hidden things from them. It was that they had never thought to look. As I read through the filings, I felt something shift inside me, something heavy and slow like sediment finally settling at the bottom of a river. I realized how much I'd accepted over the years, how much I'd absorbed from the silences, the glances, the half-smiles that told me I wasn't someone worth paying attention to. And now, in a single night, The evidence of who I had become sat before me in black and white, concrete, unavoidable. The deeper I went into the documents, the more the pieces of my life rearranged themselves. I saw the projections I'd modeled late at night, the patent approvals I'd fought for, the investor pitches I'd delivered, with my hands shaking behind closed doors. I saw decisions I'd made alone, battles I'd won without witnesses, and risks that had cost me sleep for months at a time. But what struck me hardest were the timestamps. 15 years of work, 8 years of quantum development, 4 years of scaling, 2 years of negotiation, 1 year of preparation for the IPO. All the while, my family thought I was wasting time. My throat tightened. I remembered the countless evenings sitting at that same desk while muffled laughter floated down the stairs from the living room, Michael visiting with new stories of promotions, bonuses, and praise. I'd hear the soft lift in Dad's voice whenever Michael spoke, the clink of glasses as they toasted his achievements, the faint shuffle of Mom, adjusting chairs so he had the good seat. Meanwhile, I worked in silence, the machines humming around me, like the only ones who understood what I was building. I clicked through more documents, internal emails, draft press releases, investor comments. And with every page, a slow-burning realization spread through me. My family had never truly seen me. Not because I hadn't shown them who I was, but because they'd never believed it mattered. The faint glow of my monitors washed over my hands as I opened one last file, a compiled media package with my photograph attached. They'd taken the picture at a board meeting months earlier, the sharp scent of coffee in the air, cold water beads sliding down a glass at my elbow as the photographer asked me to hold still. I'd never expected it would end up on the front page of anything. Seeing my own face next to the words "Visionary Founder" sent a shiver through me, a strange mix of pride, sorrow, and something harder resolve. For years, I had allowed their version of me to shape how I walked into a room, how I spoke, how I held myself. But that version no longer existed. It couldn't. Upstairs, the house was quiet. Snow tapped against the basement window, soft and steady like a distant heartbeat. I leaned back in my chair, letting the cold air brush against my skin, and thought about all the moments that had led here, the cafeteria, the mantle trophies, the Thanksgiving questions, the corner chairs. I had spent most of my life believing that my achievements weren't real, unless they impressed the people upstairs. But the truth was that I had built something extraordinary precisely because I had stopped trying to impress them. The more documents I read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just success. It wasn't luck. It wasn't chance. It was mine. And something inside me, the part that had stayed quiet for years, began to rise. I thought of Michael offering me an entry-level tech support position at his firm, his voice thick with condescension as he explained how sophisticated the work would be. I thought of Sarah calling me an embarrassment as though she were doing me a favor by speaking aloud the judgment everyone shared. I thought of Mom's worried eyes, Dad's careful tone, the way every conversation about my future ended with a sigh or a change of subject. My fingers curled slightly at my sides. The servers let out a soft hiss, as though the room itself was urging me forward. This was no longer about proving anything to them. It was about reclaiming what had always been mine, my story, my worth, my voice. I closed the final document, the monitor fading into a dark reflection of my face. The basement felt colder suddenly, the shadows heavier, as if the house above me sensed something shifting in its foundation. I knew what I had to do. Christmas was 2 days away. The family would gather, the house full of warm smells, cinnamon pine, the buttery scent of Mom's rolls. Michael would be at the center of the room, laughter carrying like always. Sarah would hold her wine glass too tightly. Dad would adjust his glasses, leaning forward to hear every detail of their successes. And for the first time in my life, I would walk into that room, holding the truth they had never suspected. I rose from my chair, the cold floor stinging my feet as I crossed the basement. At the bottom of the stairs, I paused, one hand on the railing, listening to the quiet house breathing above me. A new resolve settled into my bones, steady, unshakable. They wanted to know who I really was. They were about to find out. Michael froze with his wine glass halfway to his lips when I stood from the corner chair, the room falling into an unnerving stillness. The fireplace popped behind me, sending a thin shower of sparks upward as every head turned in my direction. The lights above the dining table glowed soft and golden, catching the edge of the envelope I placed beside the untouched ham. Its crisp flap snapped open with a sound that cut through the last traces of laughter. I felt 20 pairs of eyes lock on me as I slid the printed document onto the table, my name stamped across the top in bold Emma Carter, founder and CEO. Sarah's smile faltered. Mom's hand went still over the serving spoon. Dad's breath caught audibly as the paper glided across the polished wood and stopped inches from Michael's plate. The room seemed to inhale with him as he reached for it, fingertips brushing the page like he wasn't sure if he was allowed to touch it. "Read it," I said quietly. My voice carried anyway, and for the first time that night the family wasn't looking past me. They weren't dismissing me or nodding politely or shifting in their chairs. They were staring at me, waiting. What happened next didn't begin in that dining room, though it felt like it had been building there for years. I should tell you how the moment took shape long before I rose from that chair, long before the world knew my name. The morning of the gathering snow dusted the driveway in a thin white sheet that cracked beneath my shoes as I walked toward the house. I'd tucked the documents into my bag, the cold paper stiff under my fingers when I zipped it shut. The car heater blew warm air across my face, but it didn't reach the ache sitting deep in my chest. I hadn't slept. Not really. In the hours before dawn, I'd printed everything: press drafts, valuation statements, ownership records, each page sliding out with a soft mechanical sigh. The basement smelled faintly of solder and cold metal as I packed them into the envelope. I wasn't planning revenge. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about stepping into a truth I'd hidden from the people who shaped the quietest parts of me. By the time I arrived, the house was already full. The warm scent of cinnamon rolls drifted through the foyer. Mom's laughter floated from the kitchen in soft waves. Dad adjusted his glasses as he greeted me, hands slightly trembling from age and the December chill. Everything looked so normal, so familiar. But I carried something into that house that would not let the day stay ordinary. I waited. I listened. I let the conversations swirl the way they always did around promotions, travel plans. Michael's latest career triumph. The heat from the fireplace brushed my ankles as relatives drifted across the living room in comfortable patterns. I watched Sarah refill her glass with a smooth motion. Watched Michael lean back in his favorite chair as though the room belonged to him. Then she said it again. The word that had followed me for most of my life, spoken so casually it barely disturbed the air. Embarrassment. It left her lips with a light laugh, but the sound hit me like a cold draft through a cracked window. That was when I stood. Back in the dining room, Michael finally lifted the document and scanned the first few lines. His jaw slackened. He blinked once, then again, as though the room had tilted in front of him. The overhead lights reflected off the page, washing his face in pale gold. "This isn't real," he murmured. But he didn't sound confident, not the way he usually spoke, full of that effortless, inherited certainty. Dad reached for the paper with trembling hands. Mom leaned in the silver bracelet on her wrist, catching the light as she steadied herself against the table. The air tasted like roasted ham and confusion, thick and warm and suffocating. "What is this?" Dad whispered. "The truth," I said. The words settled heavily between us like dust on an old photograph, suddenly exposed to light. Their eyes moved from the document to me, back to the document, then to me again. The silence was so complete, I could hear the faint whistle of wind outside, brushing against the frozen window panes. But the envelope held more than just my title. I reached in again and pulled out the second set of papers, thinner, more delicate, the ink slightly smudged from the cold. This was the part I hadn't planned to show them. The part I discovered only because one of Quantum Dynamics' financial officers flagged a suspicious inquiry tied to my personal information. Something that didn't come from a journalist or an investor. I laid those pages beside the first. Michael's name was printed across the top. I think I said softly, "You should explain this before anyone jumps to conclusions." He stiffened. A flush crept up his neck, visible even in the dim amber lighting. Sarah leaned in curiosity, rising on her face like steam off a winter cup of tea. Dad adjusted his glasses with a slow, trembling gesture. Michael didn't touch the papers. So I did it for him. "They're records," I said. "Requests made from your office network. Attempts to access the confidential financial filings tied to my company's IPO." A murmur rippled across the room, soft but sharp, like the rustle of crumpled gift wrap. The fireplace behind me cracked loudly, sending a brief wave of heat rolling toward us. "That's no Emma. That's not, those aren't—" Michael stammered. "There's more," I said. I slid another page out. This one, an email printout, drafted from his work account, sent to his personal address. Subject line: Potential ownership transfer. Mom covered her mouth. Dad's breath left him in a low, strangled sigh. Sarah's wine glass wobbled in her hand, the deep red liquid shimmering dangerously close to the rim. I felt the weight of every year between us pressing into my ribs. Every silence, every dismissal, every time he nudged me aside without ever looking back. "You weren't trying to help me," I said, my voice calm but unshakable. "You weren't offering me guidance. You were trying to figure out how to position yourself, how to benefit from something you knew nothing about." "That's not true," he snapped, but even he didn't sound convinced. "I was curious. That's all." "No," I said. "You were trying to find out how much control I had. Whether you could persuade me, pressure me to partner with you. The internal note attached to your inquiry spells it out clearly." I pushed the last document toward him. It slid smoothly across the table, like it knew where it needed to land. "Subject is inexperienced. Could be convinced to restructure ownership if guided by a trusted figure." A heavy, icy silence swallowed the room. Mom's eyes filled with tears. Dad stared at Michael like he was studying a stranger. "You did this?" Dad asked, voice thin. "To your sister?" Michael swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed slowly, his breathing shallow and quick. "I didn't mean Dad. I didn't know, Emma. It wasn't Sarah," stepped back from the table, face pale, wineglass trembling. That's highly unethical," she whispered. "You could lose your license for accessing confidential filings like that." He rounded on her. "Stay out of this. You dragged yourself into it," she said, stepping farther away, as if distance could shield her from the fallout. I watched him crumble, not gleefully, not triumphantly, but with a quiet, solemn clarity. He'd spent years looking down at me from a pedestal built on family perception. Now he stood there exposed under soft chandelier light, not as the golden child or the rising banker, but as a man who had tried to manipulate what he didn't respect and didn't understand. When he looked at me again, his expression was a mix of anger and shame, swirling like storm clouds gathering behind his eyes. "You should have told me," he said hoarsely. "I could have helped you." I let out a slow breath. The room held it with me. "You never helped me," I said gently. "You helped the version of me you believed in, the one who stayed small enough for you to manage." A faint clatter came from the kitchen as someone accidentally bumped a dish. The noise scattered across the hardwood like broken glass. Mom reached toward me, her fingers trembling. "Emma, we didn't know." "I know I said, that's the point." For a moment, no one moved. The warmth from the fireplace brushed my back, but the air around the table felt cold, like winter air seeping through the seams of an old house. Then I gathered the papers into the envelope, the textured flap brushing against my fingers as I sealed it shut. The room watched me. No one spoke. No one dared. I stepped back from the table, the soft thud of my heels on the hardwood echoing in the stunned quiet. My breath came out in thin streams that wavered in the warm air of the dining room. Behind me, someone whispered my name, but I didn't look back. The truth had landed. The silence that followed was theirs to sit with. The silence after I left the dining room clung to me like the cold December air outside. The door clicked shut behind me with a soft finality, and for a moment, I just stood on the porch, feeling the winter wind brush across my face. The snow had begun to fall again, thin flakes drifting lazily under the porch light, settling in my hair and melting against my cheeks. My breath came out in slow, even clouds, and with each exhale, the pressure in my chest loosened. It was the first time in years that the night sky felt wide enough to hold what I carried. I walked down the front steps, the snow creaking beneath my boots. And when I reached my car, I paused with my hand on the door handle. Inside the house behind me, everything had changed. Not because I had punished anyone or demanded anything, but because the truth had simply landed where it needed to. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of where the pieces would fall. Something had shifted quietly but irrevocably, and I could feel it settling into place. Driving home that night, the roads were nearly empty. Streetlights cast long golden beams across the snow-lined pavement, and the rhythmic swoosh of the wipers blended with the hum of the engine. I kept the heater low, enjoying the cool edges of the air against my fingertips. By the time I reached my house, the sky had deepened to a quiet indigo. I stepped inside and flicked on the living room light, watching the warm glow spill across the hardwood floors. The faint smell of cedar from my Christmas wreath lingered in the entryway. Everything felt calmer, cleaner, like the space had been waiting for me to come back as myself. In the days that followed, I found a rhythm I hadn't known I was craving. The first real act of reclaiming wasn't financial. It wasn't about numbers or accolades or the documents I'd sealed in that envelope. It was something far simpler. I spent the morning after Christmas cleaning my basement workspace, wiping down the metal shelves, dusting the server racks, opening the small window near the ceiling to let in a breath of cold winter air. The scent of frost and pine drifted inside, mixing with the faint warmth of the machines. I rolled up the old rug I'd used for years and replaced it with a new one, thicker, softer, something I chose not out of necessity, but out of intention. As I worked, tiny dust motes floated in the beams of morning light, swirling in slow, graceful patterns. For the first time, this wasn't a hiding place. It was a studio, a command center, a foundation. It was mine. As for my family, the days after the reveal were quiet. There were texts, apologies from Mom, long and trembling, short, restrained ones from Dad, a single sentence from Sarah. But from Michael, nothing. The silence didn't sting the way I thought it might. It simply felt familiar. This time, though, I didn't lean toward it. I didn't try to fill it. I set simple boundaries instead. Gentle, calm ones. When Mom called a few days later, her voice thick with emotion, I stepped outside to take the call. The cold air carried her apologies in fragile threads. I listened, leaning against the porch railing, the wood cool beneath my palms. "Emma," she said softly, "we should have asked more questions. We should have looked closer." "I know," I said, "but we can start fresh. Just with honesty this time." Her breath caught a soft sound like someone finally setting down a heavy load. Dad reached out a few days later with a quiet message. "Proud of you." "Truly," I replied with gratitude, but I didn't rush to repair anything. Healing wasn't about rushing. It was about choosing. Michael did call eventually. 2 weeks later, on an afternoon so bright it made the snow shimmer like glass, his name flashed on my phone. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice was calmer than I'd expected, stripped of the bravado he carried into every room. "I messed up," he said. "No excuses, no qualifiers." "I know," I replied. And there was silence, an honest one. We talked for a few minutes, keeping it careful measured. I didn't offer him a shortcut to forgiveness, and he didn't ask for one. When the call ended, I felt neither victory nor resentment, just space, the kind I needed. During those weeks, I found myself leaning naturally toward the people who had shown quiet kindness long before any headline carried my name. My neighbor, Mrs. Benton, the retired science teacher who used to bring over lemon cookies when I worked late, dropped off a small plant one morning. A winter cactus with a single red bloom. "Thought your place could use a touch of color," she said, placing it gently into my hands. The pot felt warm from her gloves. A few friends from my team reached out, offering to help with anything I needed. We met one afternoon for coffee at a small cafe that always smelled faintly of espresso and toasted bread. Sitting there, surrounded by people who saw me long before the world did, I felt something subtle but profound, a sense of belonging that didn't require performance. I also spent time walking through my neighborhood in the crisp January air, the cold pinching my cheeks, my boots crunching over patches of frozen grass. Those walks became a ritual, a way of clearing the leftover noise from my mind. And slowly I began to build something new. Not a company, not a title, something quieter, more personal. I started renovating the spare room upstairs, a space I'd ignored for years. I painted the walls a soft, warm gray. The fresh scent of paint lingered for days, clean and faintly sweet. I assembled a wooden bookshelf, running my fingers along the grain as I filled it with books I loved but had never had time to display. On a bright morning in February, sunlight streamed through the open window as I placed a small framed blueprint on the desk. It was the original sketch for the processor that became quantum dynamics' first breakthrough. A reminder that the best things in my life had come from listening to my own voice. When I stepped back, the room looked different, lighter, more open, like a space made for someone who finally believed she deserved it. One evening, after finishing the last of the renovations, I stood by that same window watching the sun sink behind the snow-covered trees. The room glowed with the soft amber of twilight. The air was still, and in that moment, I felt something inside me settle, an understanding I hadn't been able to reach before. The world had changed. My story had changed. But the real shift wasn't in the headlines or the bank accounts or the stunned expressions at that Christmas table. It was in the quiet, the calm, the stillness I finally felt within myself. And as I stood there, hands tucked into my sweater sleeves, the house warm around me, I understood something simple and true. Sometimes we don't rise to prove others wrong. Sometimes we rise just to finally see ourselves clearly.